The Glimmer, a luxurious restaurant on one of London's busiest streets, is a symbol of opulence and class. The three-story building, with its shimmering glass facade, reflects the glow of streetlights every evening. Inside, tables draped in pristine white silk cloths are set with meticulously polished silverware and crystal wineglasses that gleam under the glow of grand chandeliers. Soft jazz music drifts from a corner of the room, blending with the hushed conversations of wealthy patrons, business executives in expensive suits, elegant women in dazzling evening gowns, and distinguished older couples exuding sophistication. For many, dining at the Glimmer is not just about enjoying a meal, it is a statement of social status. An experience reserved for those who can afford its luxury. On a bustling Friday evening, just as the restaurant's exterior lights flickered on, George Howard stepped through the revolving glass doors. At 45, George was a tall, broad-shouldered man, still carrying traces of the athletic build that had made him a star in the NBA. But his days under the bright lights of the court were behind him. He had since dedicated himself to philanthropy with unwavering passion. Tonight, he wore a light blue cotton shirt, slightly frayed at the cuffs, faded jeans, and well-worn sneakers, the same outfit he had worn all day at a homeless shelter in East End. His dark hair, streaked with a few strands of gray, was casually brushed back, and his warm brown eyes held a calm, steady presence. He wore no expensive watch or flashy accessories, just a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Carrying a few charity documents he needed to review, George smiled at the hostess, a young woman named Sophie, and spoke in a deep, gentle voice. "I don't have a reservation. Do you have any tables available?" Sophie, accustomed to greeting impeccably dressed patrons, was momentarily surprised by his casual appearance but remained professional as she replied, "Of course, sir, I'll have a server take you in." George nodded in thanks and followed Sophie deeper into the restaurant, unaware of the curious glances from nearby diners. To him, the Glimmer wasn't just a place to eat, it was an investment. One of the assets he had co-owned for years, though he rarely visited as its proprietor. Behind the service counter, Emily Carter, a 23-year-old ambitious waitress, was meticulously polishing wineglasses with a white cloth. With her blonde hair tied up high, soft pink lipstick, and a black and white uniform hugging her slender figure, Emily stood out like a delicate flower amidst the opulence of the Glimmer. She came from a small town in northern England, where she had grown up dreaming of escaping an ordinary life and reaching for something greater. Working at the Glimmer was the first step in her plan, not just a job that brought in generous tips but also an opportunity to meet the wealthy and powerful. People who could open doors to her future. But Emily had a habit she couldn't shake. She judged people by their appearance, the clothes they wore, the way they spoke, and how much they were willing to spend. To her, a worthy customer had to exude wealth at first glance, and George Howard, in her eyes, was not one of them. As Sophie led George to Emily's section, the young waitress glanced at him from head to toe, her pale blue eyes flashing briefly with disdain. The worn-out shirt, the old sneakers, the tired posture of a man who had spent a long day on his feet, it all made her immediately categorize him as a low-value customer. "Good evening, sir," Emily said, her voice polite but distant, lacking the usual warm smile she reserved for high-paying guests. "Where would you like to sit?" Before he could answer, she gestured toward a small table near the kitchen, a cramped, noisy spot filled with the clang of pots and the faint smell of grease. A place typically reserved for unimportant guests. George glanced at the table, then at Emily, before offering a small smile. "Anywhere is fine, thank you." He sat down, placed his backpack on the chair beside him, and quietly opened the menu without a word of complaint. Emily turned away and muttered to a nearby colleague, "Look at that shirt. He probably just got off a shift at a factory. I wonder if he can even afford a glass of water here." She scoffed, then quickly redirected her attention to a group of sharply dressed businessmen who had just entered, customers she believed would leave generous tips. As for George, she didn't bother to give him a second thought. assuming he was just someone who had wandered into the Glimmer by mistake. But when he placed his order, a Wagyu steak with red wine sauce, the most expensive item on the menu, Emily couldn't hide her skepticism. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. "That dish isn't cheap, and it's not something just anyone can handle." George looked up, his expression calm as ever, and simply smiled. "I think I'll give it a try, but I appreciate your concern." Emily shrugged, jotted down the order carelessly, and walked away with an indifferent attitude. In her mind, George was just a man trying to appear sophisticated without actually having the means. She had no idea that beneath that simple exterior, George Howard was a billionaire philanthropist, a former basketball star, and, more importantly, a co-owner of the Glimmer, the very place where she worked and pinned her hopes for the future. His visit to the restaurant wasn't just an ordinary meal, it was the beginning of a lesson that Emily, and the Glimmer, would never forget. After seating George Howard at a small table near the kitchen, Emily Carter returned to the service counter with a smirk on her face. In her mind, he was an outsider in the luxurious world of the Glimmer, a restaurant she believed was only for the wealthy. For those who truly deserved her attention, his worn-out shirt and old sneakers were all she needed to make a judgment. He didn't belong here. And he certainly couldn't afford a meal at this place. To Emily, every customer was an opportunity, not just for tips but for connections with people who could elevate her life. And George, in her eyes, was not one of them. As George sat down, he opened the menu, his warm brown eyes scanning the words with interest. He wasn't in a hurry, nor did he seem bothered by the hidden corner seat or the kitchen noise, the clatter of pans, the head chef barking orders, and the faint scent of oil lingering in the air. He simply sat there, unfazed, as if he were at a casual diner rather than an upscale restaurant. Emily watched him from a distance, hands on her hips, and muttered to a colleague named Liam, "Look at him, probably thinks ordering the cheapest dish is enough to blend in. I bet he'll just ask for tap water to save money." Liam, a tall and lean young man with an easygoing smile, shrugged. "Who knows, Emily? Maybe he just wants to relax." But Emily shook her head, her voice full of certainty. "Relax? Here? Dressed like that? He should go somewhere else to relax." When George raised his hand to call for service, Emily deliberately took her time walking over, as if serving him was an unnecessary burden. Standing by his table, holding a small notepad, she asked in a cold tone, "What do you want?" George smiled, unfazed by her attitude, and replied, "I'd like to try the grilled Wagyu beef with red wine sauce. And a glass of water, please." Emily raised an eyebrow, unable to hide her skepticism. Wagyu beef was the most expensive item on the menu, a premium cut imported from Japan, costing nearly £200, not including tax and service fees. She let out a sarcastic chuckle and said mockingly, "Are you sure? This dish isn't cheap, and it's not something just anyone can appreciate. Maybe I should recommend something simpler?" She emphasized the word, simpler, as a way of ridiculing him, implying that he wasn't sophisticated enough to enjoy fine dining. George looked at her, still maintaining his calm smile. "It's fine. I think I'll enjoy it. Thank you." Emily jotted down the order but couldn't resist adding a snide remark. "I hope you brought enough money. We don't allow dishwashing to pay off bills here." Without waiting for his reaction, she turned away and headed straight for the group of businessmen she had been eyeing since they walked in. For them, she put on a bright smile, bowed slightly, and enthusiastically greeted, "Good evening, gentlemen. Tonight, we have an exquisite red wine from Tuscany that pairs perfectly with our main courses. How can I assist you?" The stark contrast between how she treated George and how she catered to wealthy customers was so blatant that it bordered on absurd. While waiting for his meal, George remained seated, lightly tapping his fingers on the table as his gaze wandered around the restaurant. He didn't complain about the kitchen noise or Emily's attitude. Instead, he pulled a small notebook from his backpack and started jotting down notes, perhaps plans for his next charity project. But Emily didn't care. To her, he was just another man pretending to be someone he wasn't. When the Wagyu beef was ready in the kitchen, she deliberately delayed serving it, letting the dish sit on the counter long enough to cool before finally bringing it to George's table. "Here's your meal," she said, setting the plate down carelessly, her tone flat, as if the task wasn't worth her attention. "Hope you enjoy it, though I'm not sure you even know how to eat it." George looked up, still as polite as ever. "Thank you, it looks delicious." He picked up his knife and fork, carefully cutting into the meat and savoring each bite as if it were a ritual he had long been familiar with. From a distance, Emily watched him with suspicion, waiting for a moment of hesitation or discomfort, but it never came. George ate slowly, enjoying his meal, even nodding in satisfaction as he tasted the red wine sauce. This unsettled Emily, but she quickly dismissed the feeling, convincing herself that he was merely putting on an act to cover up his inadequacy. Throughout the evening, Emily continued to treat George with indifference. When he ordered a cup of coffee after his meal, she deliberately delayed bringing it for more than 10 minutes, offering no apology when she finally placed it on the table. "Here's your coffee," she said flatly, setting the cup down carelessly before immediately turning her attention to an elderly couple who had just walked in, customers she believed would leave a much better tip. To Emily, George wasn't worth her time or effort. She had no idea that behind his simple appearance and patient demeanor, George Howard was a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of fame, a billionaire who quietly owned a stake in the Glimmer. More importantly, he was someone who would teach her a lesson she would never forget. George Howard sat at the small table near the kitchen of the Glimmer, the dim light from a wall-mounted lamp casting a soft glow on his face, highlighting the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, traces of years spent on the basketball court and long days dedicated to charity work. The noise from the kitchen, the sound of knives chopping meat, oil sizzling, and chefs shouting orders, didn't bother him. He picked up his knife and fork, cutting into the grilled Wagyu beef with precision and savoring each bite, as if he were enjoying a moment of peace amid the storm of rudeness from Emily Carter. Despite her mockery, the delayed service, and the way she treated him as if he didn't belong there, George remained unbothered. He maintained his calm demeanor, a gentle smile on his lips, and a level of courtesy that would surprise anyone who took the time to notice. When Emily placed the Wagyu beef on the table carelessly and made a sarcastic remark, "Hope you like it, though I'm not sure you even know how to eat it," George looked up, his warm brown eyes meeting hers. He didn't respond with anger or argument. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Thank you, I'm sure I'll enjoy it. It looks wonderful." His voice was deep and calm, without a hint of sarcasm or resentment. Emily hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by his reaction. She had expected him to be flustered or defensive, like many other customers unfamiliar with the luxury of the Glimmer. But George did neither. He just smiled and continued cutting into his steak, savoring each bite with quiet focus and clear satisfaction. When Emily finally returned with his coffee, over 10 minutes late and without an apology, she set it down indifferently. "Here's your coffee." George glanced at the cup, then at her, still wearing that same composed smile. "Thank you very much. I really appreciate your service." His words were genuine, without a trace of sarcasm, despite the fact that anyone could see there was little to be grateful for. Emily shrugged and walked away without replying, but a strange, uncomfortable feeling stirred inside her. Why wasn't he getting angry? Why didn't he complain to the manager or show even the slightest annoyance like other customers would? His calm demeanor made her feel as if she had just thrown a punch at thin air. There was no reaction she could latch onto to continue her arrogance. Throughout the meal, George didn't let Emily's sarcasm affect his mood. When she had mocked his financial ability, "Hope you brought enough money. We don't accept dishwashing as payment here," he simply chuckled and replied in a playful yet polite tone, "I'll do my best to make sure you don't have to wash dishes for me." "Thanks for the reminder." His response was both courteous and witty, making Emily pause for a brief second, unsure how to respond. She was used to customers either snapping back in frustration or silently enduring her jabs. But George was different. He didn't get drawn into her game. Instead, he turned her sarcastic remarks into opportunities to display kindness and patience. George continued his meal calmly, as if the small, tucked-away table near the kitchen was the best seat in the restaurant. He didn't ask to be moved, didn't call for the manager to complain, and didn't show the slightest irritation when Emily deliberately ignored him to focus on the wealthier guests. Instead, he pulled a small notebook from his backpack, jotting something down with a pen, occasionally glancing around the room. At one point, he made eye contact with a young boy, about 5 years old, playing with a silver spoon at a nearby table. George gave him a small wave, making the boy giggle. It was a simple gesture, yet it radiated warmth, something Emily completely overlooked as she busied herself catering to the well-dressed businessmen in the corner. George's patience extended beyond simply enduring Emily's rudeness. It was evident in how he treated her. Despite the fact that she hardly deserved it, when he finished his meal and requested the check, Emily brought the bill over with an indifferent expression. "Here, make sure you check it carefully. I assume you know how to read?" George smiled, unfazed by the insult. He glanced at the bill before pulling a credit card from his wallet, not the cheap kind she had imagined, but a sleek, black card, the kind reserved for the ultra-wealthy. "Thank you," he said, handing it to her. "The service here is quite special." His tone carried no sarcasm, only genuine sincerity, as if he truly appreciated the experience, just not in the way Emily expected. For a split second, Emily hesitated when she recognized the card, an American Express Centurion. It was a symbol of extreme wealth, one she had only ever seen in the hands of high-profile VIPs. But she quickly brushed the thought aside, convincing herself that he must have borrowed it from someone to keep up appearances. She swiped the card and returned it to him without another word before hurrying off to serve another table. George didn't seem to mind. He left a generous tip, £50, more than she had expected from anyone that night, and stood up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. Before leaving, he turned back to Emily with a gentle smile. "Have a great evening." His farewell was simple yet warm, a subtle reminder that he bore no resentment toward her, no matter how poorly she had treated him. George stepped out of the glimmer, leaving behind a confused Emily and a lesson she had yet to realize. His patience and kindness weren't just his way of dealing with rudeness, they were the essence of a man who had lived, who understood that respect went beyond appearances or social status. And in that moment, whether she knew it or not, he had planted a seed of change that Emily would soon have to face. In the elegant ambiance of the glimmer, where soft jazz melodies blended with the hushed conversations of diners, Emily Carter's rude behavior toward George Howard had not gone unnoticed. The small table near the kitchen, though tucked away from the restaurant's main view, was still within the sightline of a few observant guests. Emily's arrogance, from her mocking remarks to her deliberate delays and indifferent service, had drawn attention. And George's remarkable composure only highlighted the unfairness of the situation. Whispers began to spread, discreet glances were exchanged, and a few patrons could not conceal their disapproval of the young waitress's attitude. At a corner table by the window, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a distinguished older couple, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. Arthur Smith, with his neatly tailored gray suit and silver hair, was a retired businessman who had once managed a chain of luxury hotels. His wife, Eleanor, elegantly dressed in an emerald silk gown with a string of pearls around her neck, was a former educator with a keen eye for human behavior. They had come to the glimmer not just for the food but for the refined atmosphere they considered a symbol of sophistication. Tonight, however, that sophistication was being disrupted by Emily, as Emily carelessly placed the Wagyu steak in front of George and sneered, "Hope you like it, though I doubt you know how to eat it." Eleanor frowned slightly. She turned to her husband and murmured, "Arthur, did you see that? The way she's treating that man is completely unacceptable." Arthur nodded, his gaze resting on George, who simply smiled and responded with unwavering politeness. "Thank you, it looks wonderful." Lowering his voice, Arthur said, "There's something different about that man. Look at how he carries himself, calm and kind, even in the face of such disrespect. That's rare. Eleanor tightened her grip on her wine glass. I don't understand how a place like the Glimmer allows a waitress like her to behave that way. It's disgraceful. A few tables away, Olivia Bennett, a successful young entrepreneur in the tech industry, couldn't take her eyes off what was happening. At 32, with sleek black bobbed hair and an elegant gray business suit, Olivia was dining with her close friend, Chloe. She was a regular at the Glimmer, frequently bringing clients here for business meetings, and she had always admired the restaurant's professionalism. But tonight, she was furious when Emily brought George's coffee 10 minutes late without a single word of apology. Olivia leaned toward Chloe, her voice laced with frustration. Did you see that? That waitress is treating him like he doesn't even deserve to be here. I can't believe a high-end restaurant would allow this kind of attitude. Chloe, a sharp-eyed freelance journalist, nodded. I agree, but look at him, he's not complaining. Still polite. Someone like that, he's not just some random guy. The growing unease wasn't limited to Mr. and Mrs. Smith or Olivia. Several other diners had started to notice. At a nearby table, 3 men in suits, likely lawyers or bankers, exchanged murmurs as they witnessed Emily's mocking comments about George's finances. Did you hear her? One of them whispered, sounding incredulous. She thinks he can't afford his meal? Look at how he's eating that wagyu. Most people wouldn't even know how to appreciate it properly. Another man nodded. She must be new, doesn't know how to read people. But that guy, he's got patience. If I were him, I would have called the manager by now. A quiet ripple of discontent spread through the restaurant. The murmurs weren't loud enough to cause a scene, but they were enough to create an undercurrent of silent disapproval, one that would soon reach its tipping point. Mr. and Mrs. Smith continued to observe George, their admiration for him growing with each passing moment. When he pulled out a small notebook from his backpack and began jotting down notes, Eleanor remarked, "He's not flustered or annoyed at all. Look at how he sits, confident, composed, like that table by the kitchen is exactly where he wants to be." Arthur nodded. I've met people like him in the hospitality industry. They don't need to show off, but their presence says everything. That waitress is making a serious mistake. Eleanor took a sip of her wine, her gaze never leaving George. I just hope someone does something. This can't go on. Olivia, on the other hand, wasn't as patient as the elderly couple. She turned to Chloe, her voice slightly raised. I can't take this anymore. This restaurant is one of my favorites. But if they let their staff treat customers like this, I'm not coming back. That man doesn't deserve this. Chloe placed a hand on Olivia's shoulder, trying to calm her down. Take it easy. The manager will probably notice soon. But I agree, he's remarkable. Not many people would stay that composed. Olivia shook her head, gripping her glass tightly. I just hope she pays for that attitude. The growing attention and silent outrage weren't just reactions to Emily's rudeness. They were an unspoken acknowledgement of George. Without demanding respect, without a single complaint, his calm demeanor and kindness had drawn the eyes of everyone around him. Ironically, Emily's attempt to push him into obscurity had only made him the center of attention. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Olivia, and the other diners didn't know who George really was. But they could sense he was no ordinary man. And soon, the stark contrast between Emily's arrogance and George's quiet dignity would lead to a moment that no one in the restaurant would forget. The atmosphere in the Glimmer grew increasingly tense, though the tension remained an undercurrent beneath the restaurant's elegant surface. Emily Carter's arrogance and George Howard's composure had drawn the attention of many diners, from the quiet disapproval of Mr. and Mrs. Smith to Olivia's barely contained frustration. But this was only the beginning of a turning point that no one, especially Emily, saw coming. When George finished his meal, taking the last sip of his coffee, he set the cup down and gestured for the check. Emily, still indifferent, walked over slowly and placed the bill in front of him without a glance. Here, check it yourself. George smiled, unfazed, and pulled a sleek black American Express Centurion card from his wallet. Handing it to her with a polite, "Thank you," Emily took the card, pausing briefly as she recognized it, not the usual kind of credit card. She had seen it before, always in the hands of high-profile VIP customers, but she quickly dismissed the thought that he could be one of them. He probably borrowed it from someone, she muttered to herself, then took it to the register. When the transaction went through, displaying "approved" alongside the name George Howard, a nearby staff member, Liam, suddenly gasped, "Wait, George Howard? The George Howard?" Emily shrugged, uninterested, probably just a coincidence, but Liam wasn't convinced. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the back office, where the Glimmer's manager, Mr. Davies, was reviewing the restaurant's financial records. Mr. Davies was a sharp, well-dressed man in his mid-50s, known for his meticulous management of the Glimmer. He had been part of the restaurant since its grand opening, one of the few people who knew the identities of the establishment's stakeholders, including George Howard, the former basketball star and philanthropist, who had been a silent co-owner for years. So when Liam burst into the office, panting, "Sir, George Howard is here. He's sitting by the kitchen." Mr. Davies shot up from his chair, his face draining of color. "What did you just say? George Howard? And no one told me?" Without another word, he rushed out of the office, his eyes scanning the restaurant. And when he finally spotted George sitting in the dimly lit corner, wearing that same calm, knowing smile, he could hardly believe what he was seeing. Mr. Davies hurried over to George's table, bowing slightly with a mix of respect and panic. "Mr. Howard, I sincerely apologize for not recognizing you sooner. I had no idea you were coming unannounced. Is there anything wrong?" George looked up, still calm. "There's nothing wrong, Mr. Davies. I just wanted to have dinner and see how things are going here." But Mr. Davies couldn't hide his growing concern. He turned to Emily, who was standing nearby with an indifferent expression, and asked in a firm voice, "How did you serve Mr. Howard?" Emily shrugged, her tone dismissive, like any other customer. "What's the big deal?" Her words were like gasoline on a fire. Mr. Davies turned back to George, then glanced around the restaurant, noticing the curious stares from the guests, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Olivia, and the group of businessmen, all watching intently. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. I'd like to introduce someone special, Mr. George Howard. He's not just a guest, he is also a co-owner of the Glimmer. We are honored to welcome him tonight." A wave of whispers swept through the restaurant. Mr. Arthur Smith murmured to his wife, "I knew it, he's no ordinary man." Olivia turned to Chloe, her eyes gleaming. "I knew it, that waitress is done for." Emily stood frozen, her face shifting from indifference to pure panic in an instant. George Howard, a billionaire philanthropist, former basketball star, and the owner of the very restaurant she worked in, was the same man she had mocked, delayed serving, and treated as if he didn't belong. She replayed every cutting remark in her mind. "Hope you brought enough money. I'm not sure you even know how to eat this." Her head spun, and her hands trembled as the weight of her mistake crashed down on her. I didn't know," she stammered, turning to George with pleading eyes. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." George stood up and placed a hand on Mr. Davies' shoulder, stopping him from scolding Emily any further. He looked at her, his warm smile unchanged. "It's okay, Miss Emily, everyone makes mistakes. I don't hold it against you." His words were sincere, free of resentment, but to Emily, they felt like a dagger to her pride. George's kindness didn't bring her relief, it only deepened her shame, because she knew she didn't deserve his forgiveness. Mr. Davies, still fuming, turned to Emily. "Do you realize what you've just done? Mr. Howard isn't just a customer. He's the one who invested in the Glimmer and kept it running. You'll have to explain yourself after your shift." Emily lowered her head, tears threatening to spill. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the restaurant, Mr. and Mrs. Smith's disappointment, Olivia's disdain, all directed at her. The truth was out, and with it came an overwhelming sense of humiliation. She had misjudged a good man, a respectable man, simply because of his unassuming appearance. Her arrogance and lack of respect hadn't just hurt George, they had made her look like a fool in front of everyone. George turned to Mr. Davies, his voice calm yet firm. "Don't be too hard on her. I think this is an opportunity for all of us to learn something." He looked around the restaurant before resting his gaze on Emily once more. "No one should be judged by their clothes or how they walk into a room. That's what I want to see here." His words rang through the room like a quiet but profound reminder, making Emily lower her head even further, burdened by the weight of her regret. After the truth about George Howard's identity was revealed, an intense silence fell over the Glimmer. Emily Carter stood with her head lowered, her trembling hands clutching the edge of her apron, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Shame consumed her, not just because she had mistreated a kind man, but because that man was a co-owner of the restaurant, a renowned philanthropist she had once admired in news articles. The diners, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Olivia, the group of businessmen, all still watched her with a mixture of surprise and disappointment. Mr. Davies, the restaurant manager, stepped forward, ready to reprimand her further. But George raised a hand to stop him, his voice calm and warm. "That's enough, Mr. Davies. I think we should leave it here. She understands her mistake." George stood up, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's before scanning the restaurant. He didn't want to turn this into a public punishment. He saw it as an opportunity for change. Not just for Emily but for the Glimmer as a whole. "Miss Emily," he said gently but with quiet authority, "I'm not angry with you. Everyone misjudges others at times. What matters is what we learn from it." He turned to Mr. Davies. "I'd like to have a meeting with the entire staff after tonight's shift. We need to talk." Mr. Davies nodded, still somewhat taken aback by George's grace. The diners gradually returned to their meals, but the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. Curiosity and expectation now lingered in the air. The meeting took place after closing time, in a small conference room behind the service counter. The entire staff, chefs, servers, and front desk employees, gathered around a long table, the soft glow of the overhead lights casting shadows over their tired yet anxious faces. Emily sat in the corner, her eyes red, unable to lift her gaze. George stood before them, dressed in the same worn-out shirt and faded jeans, without a suit or any symbol of authority. Yet his presence commanded natural respect. "I'm not here to reprimand anyone," he began, his voice low but firm. "I came to the Glimmer tonight not as an owner, but as a regular customer, and what I experienced reminded me that we can do better." He paused, looking at each person in the room before continuing. "The Glimmer isn't just a place to sell expensive meals. It's a place where people come to feel welcomed and respected, no matter what they wear or how they look. Tonight, I was treated poorly because of my appearance, but I don't blame Miss Emily. Instead, I want us to use this as an opportunity to improve, to make sure that no customer, no matter who they are, ever feels the way I did." His words weren't a dry lecture on ethics, they were a heartfelt appeal, shaped by his own experiences of being judged when he was just a poor kid before becoming a basketball star. George then proposed several changes: regular staff training on treating customers fairly, implementing an anonymous feedback system for guests to share their experiences, and fostering teamwork instead of competition over tips. Respect and kindness shouldn't be reserved only for the wealthy, he said, they should be given to everyone. That is the true value of the Glimmer. The staff nodded, and a few murmured in agreement. Liam, who had tried to warn Emily earlier, smiled. "I think you're right, Mr. Howard, we can do better." Emily, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, felt every word from George cut into her pride. As the staff began to leave, she stood up and stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Mr. Howard, I'm truly sorry. I was wrong to judge you, and I promise to change. I'll treat people better, not just because of my job, but because I realize how wrong I was." George looked at her and gave a gentle smile. "I believe you, Emily. Our mistakes don't define us, it's how we make them right that matters." His words felt like a lifeline, pulling her out of the wave of shame that had been drowning her. From that night on, Emily began to change, She paid closer attention to every customer, from those in sharp suits to those in simple clothes, always greeting them with a sincere smile. Under George's leadership, the Glimmer gradually became a new symbol, not just of luxury, but of compassion and respect. News of George's story spread, drawing attention from the press and social media. Articles praised him not only for his past success but for the way he turned a negative experience into a driving force for positive change. Customers started coming to the restaurant not just for fine dining but for the assurance that they would be treated fairly. Mr. and Mrs. Smith became regulars, often chatting with George when he stopped by, and Olivia proudly introduced the Glimmer to her business partners. Emily, once an arrogant waitress, became a passionate advocate for the values George had instilled. She learned to see beyond appearances, realizing that kindness and compassion were the true standards of worth. One evening, she served a modestly dressed man, someone she might have once overlooked, and engaged him in conversation. Later, she discovered he was a renowned writer seeking inspiration. That moment reaffirmed her belief that George had been right. Everyone deserves respect. The Glimmer didn't just change in the eyes of the public, it transformed from within. The staff grew more united, working for the shared joy of creating a welcoming atmosphere rather than just chasing tips. And George, with his patience and kindness, proved that a mistake could be the beginning of something better. Months after the pivotal meeting at the Glimmer, Emily Carter was no longer the same person she had once been. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, she stood in the small meeting room before George, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. "Mr. Howard, I know an apology can't erase what I did, but I truly regret it. You gave me a chance to change, and I promise I'll never treat anyone that way again." George smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Emily, I forgave you from the start. What matters is that you're living up to that promise, and you're doing a great job." His words felt like a warm breeze, easing the weight on her heart. From that moment on, they were no longer just employer and employee, they became friends, bonded by a lesson in kindness and respect. George continued to visit the Glimmer regularly, not to inspect, but to chat with the staff, encourage their growth, and build a genuine connection. He often sat at the same table near the kitchen, the very spot where Emily had once assigned him, as a light-hearted reminder of how change began. Emily, now always greeting customers with a warm smile, often brought him a free cup of coffee, playfully saying, "Not late this time, Mr. Howard." He would laugh, and their friendship became an inspiration for the entire team. The final scene takes place on a freezing winter day when the Glimmer hosts a charity event to serve meals to the homeless, an initiative inspired by George's unwavering belief in compassion. Standing beside him, Emily helps hand out steaming plates of food to the long line of people outside. When a man in tattered clothes thanks her, she smiles and says, "It's nothing, stay warm today." George looks at her, his eyes filled with pride. They both understand that true fulfillment doesn't come from tips or status, but from helping others and making the world a better place. And that's where George and Emily's story comes to a close. But I want to hear from you. What do you think about the lesson in kindness they shared? Have you ever changed your perspective on someone after getting to know them better? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss more heartwarming stories about kindness. Together, we can spread positivity. See you in the next video.